Okay, so let's just get started with a few housekeeping things. If you are on social media, please use the hashtag Palestine Writes to post about this session. And if you would like Arabic interpretation, there's a globe at the bottom. Please click on that and choose the language that you want. We have Arabic, that's all we have. So that's the only choice you get. You can use French if you want, but you're not going to hear anything. So let's get started. I also want to acknowledge, you can't see them, they're off camera, but we have Rawan and Arsen from Jerusalem who are doing the interpretation. And we have Siraj in Ramallah, who is our tech guru who's making everything happen. All right, so it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce my friend Rachel Holmes. I've been looking so forward to this session, you have no idea. Rachel, besides being a real sister and a true friend, is a decent, principled, authentic human being. She is a brilliant and highly acclaimed biographer of several books, including The Secret Life of James Barrie, Eleanor Marx, A Life, African Queen, The Real Life of the Hottentot Venus, and her most recent biography, which we're going to talk about today, Sylvia Pankhurst, Natural Born Rebel. Rachel is also the author of 50 Shades of Feminism, and I call myself a feminist. She curated many programs with Palestinian writers and artists, including myself, while director of literature at London South Bank Centre. From 2009 to 2014, she was a tutor and writer in residence at the Palestine Writing Workshop in the West Bank, a PalFest initiative. She is a contributor to This Is Not a Border, reportage and reflection from the Palestine Festival of Literature, and the British Refugee Tales Project, calling for the end of indefinite immigration detention in the UK. And before we go into our conversation, I would like to tell our audience that I actually spent this entire fall with this extraordinary book, this amazing epic biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, who is one of the most badass revolutionaries that most of us haven't heard of. And those who have heard of Sylvia Pankhurst often associate her with the movement for women's suffrage. And of course, she was an important part of that struggle, but she did so much more. And I just want to show you, this is how I read the book, by the way, because I didn't have, so.
Check the markups.
Yeah, yes. You have, I also have like a whole notebook of notes because I didn't just read this book, I studied it. I mean, I felt like I had a graduate course reading this. So I'm going to start with just to give you all a kind of shortened, brief picture of Sylvia Pankhurst, and then ask Rachel to elaborate on this extraordinary woman. Sylvia was an artist. That was her first calling that she gave up because she couldn't bear that kind of individualistic pursuit when she saw so much suffering around her. She actually did all of the artwork, what we would call branding today, that was associated with that movement. She was a political prisoner. She was tortured, and actually she was imprisoned and tortured more than any other suffragette. She was an investigative journalist. She founded multiple newspapers, 2 of which went on to achieve international influence at different times and had considerable effect on world politics that we're going to talk about. The Workers' Dreadnought and the New Times and Ethiopia News. She was Winston Churchill's nemesis, and he actually manhandled or assaulted her actually. Once she literally raised an army in the East End of London.
Literally,
to fight police brutality and harassment. She was a socialist, an anti-racist, at a time when being that was aberrant to the social norms. she was an anti-imperialist. She was an internationalist. Mussolini tried directly to come after her. She was on a special Gestapo list of 2,800 people that the Nazis had planned to arrest as soon as they occupied England, when they thought they were going to.
Shoot.
Yeah, exactly. She founded multiple enterprises, at-cost restaurants, a toy factory to employ women. I mean, the stuff she packed into her life. She created a tea room that hosted a lot of young African students who went on to become world leaders, including Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Amy Ashwood Garvey, the wife of Marcus Garvey, and so many others. She was a close friend of Haile Selassie, and who, by his own admission, Sylvia had a huge role in the liberation of Ethiopia. She was friends with W.E.B. Du Bois, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, George Bernard Shaw, I mean, Vladimir Lenin, and all of these people wrote amazing tributes to her when she passed away. And she was also extraordinarily prolific in almost mind-boggling. It was mind-boggling how she did that in just nearly every genre imaginable. And she had this uncanny ability to kind of see people for who they really are, including Mussolini and Hitler before anyone realized they were Mussolini and Hitler. Yeah, I mean, she packed so much into her life. And so I want to start with that, with Rachel, just how prolific she was, just to see the breadth of everything that she wrote. And I would like to hear you talk about that a little bit, because especially you bring something very new to what we know about, or what we know about Sylvia Pankhurst. And this came to you by toilet paper. So tell us about that.
Well, I certainly will talk about the toilet paper and the COVID copy edit. But first of all, I just want to thank you, Susie, for that wonderful and generous introduction, and marvelous depiction, actually, of of Sylvia in the book, and also just to say welcome to all these friends from all over the world, and say what a privilege it is to be participating in Palestine Writes, and in the first Palestine Writes. And it's just really wonderful to be here, albeit that it is from London. And diving straight in there, Sylvia's prolificness, as you put it, I mean, it's a great word, isn't it? Prolificness, because it's a long word, and it's got all that doingness in it. Was something quite daunting for the biographer, and it is why I've ended up. You kindly held up the manuscript, and I've got a finished copy here. I don't know whether you can see that on the screen. Anyway, so it's a long book, but I think biographies fit the shape of a life. And Sylvia was born in the Victorian era. She was born in 1882 in Manchester, which was very radical at that time, amid socialists and abolitionists, including American abolitionists, who used to come and visit the family home and speak on behalf of the suffragettes. Indeed, I found that very interesting, the support for the Black American abolitionists for the cause. But she lived right through till 1960. So her life is a long one, and it's all the more extraordinary, as you say, Susie, because she was tortured, brutally tortured, and force-fed and hunger-struck in prison, and what she, as well as many others, went through. And many of the suffragettes, actually, there was a long-term illness, but also death. I mean, people died either in prison or shortly after they came out of it, including Sylvia's own aunt, Mary Clark, who had a brain aneurysm on Christmas Day. She went to lie down in bed. And Emmeline, her mother, her sister, the leader of the suffragettes, just went in and found her dead. And that was because from being beaten up in prison. But Sylvia, although she always had gastroenteritis, although she had all sorts of eating and physical problems associated with that particular period of her life, she just went on in this. She was very strong. She's terrifyingly strong, and she just carried on. And she died in her bed in Ethiopia in 1960, in her late 70s. And so she lives through that epoch, and I think that the sense of the scope, and she's involved in everything, including the wars. She's rigorously and passionately pacifist in the First World War, which she sees as an unjust war, but not in the Second, which she feels is a war that obviously needs to be fought against necessary evil. On the actual point of her prolificness, she made each week 9 days long, because she used to not sleep for she used to work through the night at least one night a week, and sometimes two, particularly when she was producing her newspapers. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Thank you, Susie, because you could write, somebody does actually need to write a book about her as a newspaper editor, because she's so brilliant. And she also employed the first employed black journalist in Claude Mckay in Britain. So she brought on young women and other people through journalism as well. But so that sense of her doing stuff. She wasn't a party girl. So Eleanor Marks, my previous subject, would give me time off occasionally, because she enjoyed what we would call champagne, what German sect. She enjoyed sparkling wine. She enjoyed Uncle Engels's claret, and she would always address her correspondence at night, even if she'd had a few drinks. But she did relax and have a party. But Sylvia did not drink. She hated going to parties. She never went to parties, and indeed, when she was on tour in America, and I must say that I really, found that fascinating, that aspect of her life, her tours around America, and what she learned from America, including from the NAACP, who she was determined to speak when she was told by some of the white suffragettes that she shouldn't speak, and she did. But perhaps just to pause and say why she's relevant to Palestine. And in this context. Now, more broadly, obviously, as someone who believed in equality and justice and anti-racism and anti-fascism, all those things that you would outline, she would anyway. But it was more than that. This was something she wrote in her 1922 essay, as you've remarked elsewhere, Susie. The truth about the oil wars. And she lays out there, this is the other thing, she had a very, very fine mind. She was mathematically very good, but she was a very, very good economist. And she laid it out, and she said, the fight for these oil concessions is going to determine the future of world politics in peacetime and in what will be made of wars for it. And she predicts what's going to happen, what's going to come in the Middle East. But she also talks very specifically about what she calls the problem of Palestine and Jewish settlers in the Middle East. And I think that this is something that she was very conscious of. So it's not just that, it would be good enough, it was sort of general. And certainly when it came to the tactics of resistance, she boycott, for example, because I think that for me, in the context of Sylvia now, she's relevant for, I'm afraid, a lot of bad reasons. You don't want your book to come at a good time because fascism's on the rise again. But unfortunately, that is the case with this. But I think what's really interesting to me is how she follows and uses boycott as a campaigning, a peaceful, because she's pacifist, peaceful campaigning, a non-violent tool throughout various different aspects of her life, whether it's the suffrage struggle and indeed later with Italy and Ethiopia, but also during the 1930s, she supports the 1933 Jewish boycott of Germany, which of course started in America. But so it's something that she applies as a very useful, she believes in as a useful campaigning tool and engages in her own campaigns.
Yeah. I want to jump off of a few things you said. First of all, you mentioned Claude Mckay, who she actually went to prison for him.
She did, yeah.
Yes.
Those silly boys, yeah.
Yeah. I want you to tell us about that. And I also want to, I want to hone in on a couple other things you mentioned of her trip to the United States. One of the things that I really loved about her and I found endearing and that I could identify with was just she had no patience for polite society and for these parties. She hated dressing up. In fact, she was so unfashionable and often disheveled, which I really, I felt a personal connection with that. And her time in the U.S. was remarkable to me because everywhere she went on this tour, she insisted on visiting the prisons. She just was not interested in what privileged people were doing. She always put herself with the people she was fighting for, and she always pushed them to the forefront. Like she was always keen to ensure their own agency and take a back seat. There was one really dramatic moment in her life where she does that. She actually is prepared to die when Asquith refuses to meet with a delegation of women, of working women, and she says that well, you can talk about that. So I have so many questions, but I'll leave. And then I want to talk about boycott, and then I want to go back to her physical endurance, and then I know people are thinking about the toilet paper. So those are all the, okay.
Oh wow. Gosh, I don't know where to jump in there. I mean, we were talking about Claude Mckay, and yeah, I mean, he's a really important figure. Not always terribly kind about Sylvia, but he didn't necessarily need to be. But what happened was with him was that he came to Britain, and he was upset about the racism in actually in the left-wing press, and so he went to the left-wing newspaper editors. He wrote to them and he said, stop doing this, but also let me write and let me put a different position. And there was a kind of polite, but they didn't give him a job. They didn't publish his letters. And he wrote to Sylvia at the Workers' Dreadnought, and she immediately got in touch with him and said, come here. And, and she gave him a job. And he was really brilliant at it. And yes, there was a sedition trial. She was tried for treason because Claude Mckay and two others published what were seen to be treasonous letters in her newspaper, which were about they were seen to be citing unrest amongst the Navy because there were the unionized workers in the docks were unpacking or refusing to pack arms that were being sent to support the White Russians by the British government against the Bolsheviks. And indeed, Sylvia ended up, this was 1920, and she didn't, she was older then and she didn't want to go to prison again. And it's, I think, one of the things that came out of that for me, and also it must have resonated, I would imagine, with you, Susie, for the, your fantastic new novel Against the Loveless World. Because what these two characters, if you like, have in common is that prison experience and resistance. Actually, how do you resist from within it? But one of the things that Sylvia talks about, I think, which is very it really made me feel desperate for her at the time, was that she made the difference between when she was in prison as a suffragette. There was solidarity. They were singing out. There was singing. People would come and sing outside the windows. They would sing to eat across cells. I mean, all this stuff will be familiar to you again from the Palestinian contexts, and indeed from other, liberation struggles against, against colonization and other forms of oppression. And she said how lonely it was, how difficult it was not to have that solidarity during that period. But you were talking about her being in America, and of course the thing is that she was a lifelong prison reformer. She from firsthand experience. And I think on the question of, if I may just touch on it, on the question of class, because it does come up in terms of the people in the movement that she was meeting, the women that she was meeting in America. It is important to remember that in Britain, that posh women went to prison too, middle class women went to prison, and they'd never. It was a bit like, in fact, I think I say it in the book, and I mean this, that for the suffragettes was the equivalent of what happened in the trenches in the First World War for the men, that the class barriers broke down because they hadn't had relationships. There hadn't been relationships between women who were servants of other women, or on equal terms. And a lot of those women were changed by it very, very positively across class and indeed racial lines. And that was important. In America, yes, they had this. She spoke at the Carnegie Hall, and she had like audiences of 1,000 turning up to her events, and all over the country, and indeed in New York. But there were schedules of sort of social events put on for her, and she talked about not having time or patience for bridge balls and dinner. And she said that the whole flummery of high society should be swept away. And she said, and I should like to be the one who does the sweeping. She said that to some reporter. And there's another lovely story when she arrives. Didn't you love that, Susie? When she arrives in America for the first time in New York by ship, of course, and she's absolutely horrified because all these young reporters, mostly male, come to her hotel to interview her, and they're not taking notes.
Yeah.
She's like, what? And she goes down to the hotel lobby and she buys a pile of notebooks and pencils, comes back, gives it to these young men and says, right, now you can interview me and take proper notes and make sure it's accurate. But she, in all seriousness, she saw that what she was doing was a much broader struggle. And indeed, as you say, every single place she went to, she literally demanded to be shown around the prisons. And I warmly recommend to your attention a fabulous book called Suffragette in America by my friend and comrade and colleague, Kate Connolly, who for the first time has taken Sylvia's amazing manuscript that was never published. It was going to be a book, but for various reasons it didn't happen, and has put those together. And one is really struck by the fact that her accounts in detail of visiting jails, prisons, and her understanding of the prison system in America and how it sort of functions. And that was 1911, 1912.
So one of the things you touched on earlier that I'd like you to expand on a little bit was this kind of the physicality of that she brought. I mean, she had this incredible endurance, and I mean, besides this unspeakable torture. And by the way, I really appreciate the medical details that you go into, and her own explicit description of that torture. And it wasn't, I think people, or at least I didn't before reading this book, really appreciate the level of physical assault on women. I mean, there were rapes. It was a lot of rapes and beatings, like you said. But Sylvia used her body she weaponized her body against this. I mean, her defenseless body became her greatest weapon. Not only through the hunger strikes, but she used to walk up and down until she, I think at what time it was like 28 hours straight until
28 hours, yeah.
Passed out. Can you talk a little bit about, using this body as a battleground? I mean, we see a lot of Palestinian prisoners doing the exact same thing now, going on hunger strikes. So it's very relevant to political prisoners today. But especially, I mean, it was just striking to me what she could do with her body the extraordinary will required for that.
And I will try and summarize that. And I'd also like to say that in the process of my research, and it's obviously a deeply upsetting and unfortunate thing, but reading medical reports and other reporting and investigation into Palestinian hunger strikers were very significant amongst the materials that I used in coming to understand the impact of hunger striking, both on the mind as well as the body. I don't want to sound superficial, but she refused to eat porridge when she was a child. And given that she was going to end up in British prisons and in Holloway, where that was basically the food, this presaged very ill. Her mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the movement, was overheard saying to some of her friends that when Sylvia was about 5 or 6, that she'd given up trying to discipline her or punish her because she knew that Sylvia she would die before she would give in. And it was a very understanding remark about her resistance. So she had a quite Victorian upbringing in some ways, and yet but that this household was presided over by a father who said, again, which is sort of in keeping with the times, but was if you do not spend your life working for other people, you will not have been worth the upbringing. You will not have been worth raising. And that was what they were really brought up with that. And I find her physical courage and resistance extraordinary, but it's also really important to remember that it is in the context of people who were deeply had come through the abolitionist struggle, who were supporters of abolition, who were descended from the Chartists, who had been actually put, a lot of them had just been put on convict ships, some of which were repurposed slave ships, because once the slave trade stopped, the ship owners, needed something else to do with their repurposed ships, so they sent British convicts off to Australia, and that's a whole other history. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that was in a context of a great deal of physical bravery, and also she worked and she lived amongst working class women in the East End of London, and these are tough people. Rose Pangeli, who was a young suffragette, she started the junior suffragettes. Don't you just love that? I love that
story.
And they have their own newspaper and everything. They're just
14.
Yeah. And Rose Pangeli, and of course, this is not a suffragette story. This is not about being raped or beaten or dragged down side alleys and raped as they were on demonstrations, and also obviously abused in prison. But Rose Pangeli worked with a box cutter. She worked in a factory, and she was one of Sylvia's young elves. And there's a photograph of her. I wish I could show you. She had red hair, and she played the panpipes, and she was brilliant at it. And she danced, and there's a beautiful photograph of her at one of Sylvia's festivals, her New Year festivals. And just a week after that, Rose Pangeli's finger was cut off in an accident by a box cutter. And because it was during the war, they weren't allowed to, the other girls said, please, can you give her a little bit of brandy or something so that she doesn't pass out, and we'll take her to the hospital. And they wouldn't, first of all, because of the war rations, she wasn't allowed to have the brandy. And secondly, the foreman wouldn't permit her to be accompanied by somebody to take time off to take her to the hospital. So this 15, 16-year-old with her cut off finger gets herself on the omnibus, and she takes herself to hospital and she gets stitched up. So I think that Sylvia would always want it to be put in the context of that and other people. But the thing that's really funny about her is she really hated exercising. I mean, her daughter-in-law was really and she always she makes jokes about how she would make excuses not to do games and sports when she was a kid.
But she hiked through the Alps to debate Lenin. Yeah.
But that's the thing. But the thing is, so her daughter-in-law, the wonderful Rita Pankhurst, who I had the great honor to meet before she sadly passed last year, and she said, I couldn't, to get Sylvia go out in the garden and walk around, but if she had to walk for 28 hours up and down herself for a sleep strike, as you say, Susie, if she had to cross the Alps or the Pyrenees because she had no passport, if she had to cling on to the deck of a steamer to go and have an argument with Lenin in Moscow, she would find these resources of energy. And indeed, as you say, when she was thoroughly fed up that the Prime Minister Asquith, terrible, misogynist and against the women's vote, refused to meet the working women's deputation, women from the East End who wanted to come and present to him and explain to the Prime Minister why they wanted the vote. And one of the reasons that it was important that they did it is because he'd said, this is not a mass uprising. This is not on the scale of the Chartists, which is complete nonsense, because the hundreds of thousands, and it's really important to remember this, the scale of the uprising and resistance across Britain, not just in London, was really huge. There were these mass processions and demonstrations. And Sylvia came out from one hunger strike and she just had enough. And she said, okay. And she got her friend and lover, Keir Hardie, who was the leader of what became the Labour Party, and a couple of others. And she said, you can, and she hadn't been home. And she said, you can put me in my stretcher outside the door of the House of Commons, the Palace of Westminster. And you can send Asquith a note and you can tell him, I'm not moving in either you meet this deputation of working women or I'm going to die here. And Asquith did cave, and he did meet the deputation, and he was very impressed. He was very, very impressed by them, and it was the first time in his life that he'd actually been in a room and heard the voices and met with working women. And that's a very Sylvia story, because she's literally lying on the street. She's always working at street level. Mm-hmm. And so, but as you mentioned earlier, and I'm really glad you picked up on that, enabling, using what she has, whatever bit of power or privilege or whatever elbow room she's got, or whatever techniques and tactics, she's always putting her foot in the door, but it's to open it for other people. And that's very much her modus.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, and that was just, that was the most dramatic example. But you see it throughout her life, even, with, by employing Claude Mckay. I'm sorry, I was mispronouncing him as McKay. And so many other examples. I want to go back to the discussion of boycott, right? Because a lot of people don't know about the 1933 boycott. They know about the Nazi boycott of Jewish
against the boycott, the boycott of the boycott,
right. But that other boycott is kind of lost to history, and as you know, Palestinians have launched a global boycott campaign, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions (BDS) campaign, and very often,
which I support.
You absolutely do, and have from day one. But oftentimes one of the things that's used to discredit this boycott was the Nazi boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, and so it's compared to that. And I've always maintained that no, it's actually more similar to the 1933 boycott. And people are like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
So can you tell us, just briefly a little bit about that, and also Sylvia's involvement in that, and how she utilized her newspaper for that?
Sure. Well, just very briefly, because it's a really important part of American history, but it was the Jewish war veterans and Rabbi Stephen Wise, and they put together the 1933 boycott of Germany, and that was initiated in the US. In fact, it was sort of day of boycott against Germany in Madison Square. And reading around that, it's really interesting to see how softly the the government were treading around it, and didn't want to, the American government, but also in other parts of the world. They didn't, they sort of were really mealy mouthed. The diplomats were kind of, and the boycott were movement against the Nazis in Germany were asking for support from American politicians, from Western Europe and around the world. And I think that I'd like to sort of put it in a broader context, which is that boycott has been shown to work. And yet, I mean, what amazes me, I mean, I'm South African, and grew up in South Africa during the worst part of the dark days of apartheid, and even it's a great brand of shame actually on the British Labour Party that they took so long to support the South African boycott. They did eventually come round to it, but this sort of assumption, even that you're going to get that immediate solidarity on the left or from social democratic parties around the world, is something to question. But I think that what's so interesting is that these techniques go back and have a very venerable tradition. And indeed, as far as I can tell, and I know they go back sort of 3,000 years, and that they were used in China and various things and so on. But I suppose most recent to our history is the abolitionist movement, and the way that, like, the sugar boycott in Britain, for example, don't buy Tate and Lyle sugar. This is in the 18th century, because it's coming from plantations where where there are slaves. And then you go on through, and it's used again indeed by the suffragettes. It's used by the women's movement, and then it is used in this context. And then it's used, Sylvia deploys it in her newspaper very particularly. I mean, she supports this one, but she also uses it, and I wish I could show you some of the images, because they're so much like RBDS images now that she has in the newspaper about the boycotts against Mussolini, in order to draw attention to the his illegal invasion and attempt to subdue Ethiopia in 1935. So it's something that she would across her career understand and recognize. But I suppose I just wanted to make that bigger. We need a big history on it. I've tried to pitch to do that history, and it's surprising how uninterested publishers are. But I think that
is it really surprising?
Yeah. Are you falling off your seat there as well? Yeah. It works.
Yeah,
it works.
So we had a George Smith in the Q&A actually posted a comment, not a question. Said at the same time as the anti-Nazi boycott of German goods in 1933, the Zionists were negotiating the Havara Agreement with Nazis. Some of these Zionists worked against the anti-Nazi boycott. So you and I had a conversation before about that. It was actually Zionists who ultimately sabotaged that boycott, which, who knows what would have happened in history had it worked. And some of the other, like the activities that Sylvia was promoting, you mentioned earlier, that the dock workers, that kind of just internationalist solidarity. I mean, she, in everything she did, it was about that, and ultimately that's what took her to Ethiopia. But there's a wonderful moment in that history. The Jolly George incident.
Oh, yeah, I love that too.
That reminded me of boycott of dock workers in California who refused to load an Israeli merchant ship.
It's exactly
right?
the same tactic. It's exactly the same.
Maybe tell our viewers just a little bit about that so they know what we're talking about.
Okay, so this was during this was in the early 1920s, and as I alluded to before, the British government was supporting the White Russians. They're on the wrong side of it, like so on the wrong side of it, and were supplying munitions as well as other forms of supplies to send to back up the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. And Sylvia was part of an organization which she started with a group of other people called the Hands Off Russia campaign. And she also started PRIB, the People's Russian Information Bureau, which is a way of as its name suggests, sort of sharing information and getting stuff across. And it's really perhaps relevant just to note about her that Sylvia, you were talking earlier about things that she predicted. That in March, April 1917, she laid out that when everybody was saying the Mensheviks were going to carry it, she was like, Kerensky won't. It's not going to be the Mensheviks. It's going to be the Bolsheviks. And first of all, people had hardly heard about this. There was this guy called Lenin that she was getting to write in her newspaper. He was writing articles for her. But insofar as they had heard about it, it was always the received view, particularly in Britain and indeed on the left, that the Mensheviks, it was going to be Kerensky and the Mensheviks. And she was like, you're so wrong. And of course she was right. And so there was all this stuff going on to undermine what the revolution. And one of the reasons that was happening, it's really important, talking about more histories that need to be written, is the level of socialist inspired broad grassroots unrest in Britain that had been growing and escalating from 1910, 1911, and was moving towards the possibility of possibly, there was real fear. There were, and I outline this, it's in the book, there were Soviets set up in Britain. There were Soviets in Scotland, in Glasgow. There were Soviets in, and this interesting, this history apparently is not taught at school. Fancy that, huh? And so there was a real sense, and it explains a lot about why that war in 1914 was fought or was incited, if you like. There was a real sense of anxiety that something similar might happen in Britain. And this was part of the process of democratization. And so so Sylvia's engagement in that was absolutely consistent. And what happened with the Jolly George, and isn't it a great name? As there you are, and you have to imagine being in the Docklands. I mean, when you lived in East London in those docks, the ships just would tower above everything. The shadow of them would be there. Everybody lived with a dock worker or was a dock worker in some way, and this was the hub, if you like, of the empire. This was the beating heart of capitalism. It wasn't bloody Westminster and and all those pretty pictures that you see of red letterboxes and all that kind of stuff. That was where it was happening. And the work, there's a lovely story, and I love it too, because it's it's political espionage, isn't it, Susie? That the workers, and it actually, interestingly, navvies, sailors and people who work in the Navy famously were famously not very keen to be unionized. And so when they did start unionizing and becoming socialist effectively, and this is where the Mckay comes into it, this caused a great sense of anxiety. It was really, because the police also went on strike. And Sylvia said, when the British police went on strike, Sylvia said, Bolshevism in Britain, it's on its way. So you can see why some people are a bit anxious about this. And so there was a consignment of guns and supplies that were in boxes, and they were being sent to Russia via Poland. And so one of Sylvia's friends, a union leader and politician, went down to the docks, and he spoke to the dock workers, who, big burly guys who were like loading up and putting the stuff from the docks onto the ship. and he spoke to them and he begged them and he said, please don't break this boycott. Please don't load this stuff. And these big guys ignored him and they just carried on loading and carried on loading. And he was like, oh, maybe they just think I'm a bit posh or something because, you know, I've got a hat and a suit on and so on. And then one of the older guys came up to him, took him to the side and said, we can hear you. He said, just wait, it's all right. Don't worry, mate, it will be fine. But he felt that he'd failed. And so you know what's coming. So they loaded all the consignment onto the ship, not speaking, just kind of like doing it. And everybody's going crazy and saying, you're breaking the boycott. And everybody's running around and saying, please don't do this. And then the ship went out up the estuary, out to sea. And strangely, just as it got to sea, all the lines that were supposed to have been tied down mysteriously slipped. And the entire cargo fell into the sea.
I love that, and I love that example of sabotage, and that's you're leading me right into my next question about sabotage and property damage. So we're going to go back to the suffragette movement, and sort of try and tie it into what we see in Palestine with rock throwing, and also with the suffragettes. Who use sabotage, and tie it in with the personal too. So there was a militant campaign. Of course, the suffragettes were divided into multiple different organizations. The WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, was considered more of the militant wing. And one of the really funny moments in the book actually was when Emmeline Pankhurst, Sylvia's mother, was training to throw a rock. And that was a strategy that they used. And then, you know, the Millicent Fawcett's organization kind of eschewed that sort of militancy. And it struck me, you know, we kind of have a word for it now, or term of respectability politics, that are so similar to what we see today in liberation movements. And equally striking was the similarity of public discourse around these tactics then and today, with some people in urban and Black and brown uprisings using property damage as a form of protest, as well as, you know, as I said, the symbolism of throwing rocks that's echoed in Palestinian resistance. Can you talk about that in the context of the moment then, which, by the way, when you were talking, it reminded me how your book animated that whole history, and just hearing you now, just kind of, I can feel how exciting that would be for activists. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the question of activism, and I do a talk, I guess, that I've been doing a bit, which I call the Sylvia Pankhurst Activist Handbook. And I go through the techniques that she uses for organizing, because I think they're really useful for our young activists here, whether they're in unions or whether they're in political organizations and so on. She has a lot to remind us and teach us. And I think that's another aspect. It's really important, isn't it? What's forgotten about the suffragettes is, first of all, we've sometimes, for understandable reasons, actually talking about the nature of the torture and how it was. And there were some really good reasons for that. They didn't want to be seen as victims. And Sylvia was very unusual because she came out and she wrote accounts of it and she had them published. And she said, this is what's happening. And this drew attention to this state torture. And George Bernard Shaw was, you know, incandescent. He said, this is barbarian behavior. We're not a civilized state. This is absolutely, you know, horrendous. Of course, the king thought it was a jolly good idea. But actually, the British medical establishment were not on his side. They were very much opposed to it, and others were too. So we need to know more about that. But the other thing that does tend to be either forgotten, or I don't know how it is in America, although the American suffragettes or suffragists were quite anxious, and I write about that in the book, about, the militant campaign began while Sylvia was in America. And it's really interesting seeing the divided responses, that some of the young American sisters completely support it, and others are, we don't want to be associated with this. But I think there's something very interesting and significant about the fact that, and I think one should really, really focus on this with the suffragettes. They were, of all classes, they smashed, they burned. And there's, oh, by the way, there's this great bit, her elder sister, Sylvia's elder sister, Christabel, who was the leader of the movement, sitting in Paris, not getting her hands dirty. But anyway, that's another story. But she was a good commander in general. And she sort of said, and she sends a message to Sylvia, and she says, burn down Nottingham Castle, right? Just go and burn down this castle. And the thing that's, and Sylvia's like, no, this is really not a good idea. And so she does this bit of theatre instead to create a stint. But the funny thing about that was that Christabel hadn't taken the trouble to discover that the castle had actually been owned by the local council for the last 50 years. So it would have been a pointless act. But what's really significant, and it's very touching about Sylvia, because she hated the destruction of artworks. And I think it's a really, really serious point, because we don't want to damage any culture. And if we have to, I think it really expresses the degree, and we saw this in South Africa as well, it really expresses something about the degree of oppression and what you have to do, because because art and culture is respected. And Sylvia hated it. And in fact, there's a really funny story where she has to throw a stone at a painting in Westminster, and she kind of deliberately picks a painting that she considers a little bit inferior, and then doesn't throw her bit of cement terribly hard because she doesn't want it to shatter. But in seriousness, what's really interesting about suffragettes to me is, you may have heard, for example, that they got lots of little hammers. And they would go down the shopping streets, Oxford Street, where people are like going to get COVID today to go shopping in Primark, but that's another story. And they would smash the windows. But what were they smashing? They were smashing the windows of the retail stores that were constructing those versions of femininity that they didn't want to be oppressed by. Yeah. And Gordon Selfridge, talk about famous Americans, very famously said that he put the suffragette flags on top of Selfridge's, the department store. And obviously it was a very canny move, because it was a good way of protecting his windows. But he did actually have a daughter who was a suffragette and was very helpful both to the movement and to Sylvia later. So I think what's really interesting is when one of the suffragettes slashes the Rokeby Venus, which is a very famous painting in one of the National Galleries, she's very deliberately choosing something which is a stigmatized, as a painting of a woman naked and sexualized, and so there's a commentary within it. So I think there's a great deal of care and thought put into when they were smashing the windows of the shops. It was about breaking your own house. Yeah. It wasn't about, it's your own house that you're breaking.
We don't have a lot of time left. I want to try and get at least a couple of questions in from the audience, but I do want to touch on something regarding, you brought up her sister, and we talked about her mother very briefly. There was a split. There was a very painful split between them. And I'd like to sort of ask a question in the context of white feminism, or what that's a phenomenon that we know that's what we label it today. But it was very much expressed at the time, and it manifested itself within the personal dynamics of this of the Pankhurst family. Tell us about that. I'm going to let you explain the story, but try and keep it brief. I want to take like at least one or two questions from you.
So in brief, as you mentioned, the Pankhursts Pankhurst women founded the Women's Social and Political Union, and it was called a union for a good reason, because it was modeled on a trade union in 1906. They were all socialists, including Emmeline and Christabel at that time. They'd come out of socialist, the independent labour movement, the ILP, and so on. So it's really important to remember that context, because boy, don't they like to try and make us forget it here. And what happened in a nutshell is that Sylvia stayed a socialist, which is what her father had been, and Emmeline and Christabel did not, and they crossed over. And in fact, when they finally had won the vote and they were able to stand as well for election, they stood as Conservative, as Tory candidates.
What they did.
A lot of women did, and indeed, you know, when and this is really, really critical. So what they fell out over, they fell out over a lot of things. They fell out over Northern Ireland. That will be very much of interest to you in the American context. They fell out over the Irish Republican struggle. They fell, but it's all connected. But what they fell out over mainly was the working women's vote. So Sylvia quite simply said the women's vote is not worth anything unless all working women, i.e. working class women, have the vote. And in 1918, what the argument, or before that, before the war, what the argument was about was simply that Christabel and Emmeline believed that a qualified vote, a limited vote, so we call it the posh women's vote, so somebody with education or property would qualify, and that this would be, if you like, a sort of a cucumber slice approach, you know, and that a few women would get the vote and this would lead the way. And Sylvia said, no, if you do not take working women with you, you completely lose the argument. And bear in mind that not all working men had the vote in Britain at this time. So Sylvia believed in universal suffrage, and that was what they fell out about. She wanted votes for everybody. Christabel and Emmeline wanted to have the same rights as their husbands or, other men in their form of society, but not for their chauffeurs or their maids. I mean, not that you know. So it was they fell out over class basically, and then when the war came, they fell out over the war, and that was ultimately the breaking point. And please let's not us forget that the suffragettes, the WSPU, Emmeline Pankhurst took an amnesty deal from the government to cease the militant action, in exchange for the women suffragettes to be released from prison and ceasing and supporting the war. And which that was the break point, which they did. Yeah.
They became, you know, jingoistic even.
Yes. Jingoistic, xenophobic, horribly anti-German, anti-immigrant, anti-Italian. And of course, that then became a terrible personal, really terrible personal split between them, because the other split was over the fact that Sylvia, at the age of 45, I mean, guys, can you imagine, like then in like 1927, at the age of 45, she has her first and only child, Richard.
And she's not married.
And she's not married, and her partner, the lovely Silvio Corio, can you believe it? All right, the second love of her life is called Silvio. Like if I tried to write a novel,
I know, right?
Said, no, don't be ridiculous. You can't call them Sylvia and Silvio, but seriously, that's what they call it. And he was Italian. He was an anarcho-syndicalist. He sometime communist, and as far as Emmeline was concerned, was just some horrible immigrant. And it's so terrible because Emmeline wouldn't see Sylvia when she was pregnant. She refused to see her. She refused to she literally went and locked herself in her room and said, take that scarlet woman away. And yet this was the woman who had helped so many of her own divorced or abused women friends in her own use. Anyway, that was the nub of it. And it was class they fell out over, and by extension race.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to hear from you, because we saw that, I mean, it manifested in her family, but it also, I mean, you saw it play out when on her trips to the United States, where, they could like maybe even stomach, sort of class unions or, collaborations across class, but Sylvia's anti-racist views appalled them, her host. We have, so Alice Rothschild in the Q&A says, don't forget the toilet paper. So can you just briefly explain what I was trying to have a little teaser there.
So in short, Sylvia wrote a wonderful volume of poetry called Writ on Cold Slate. And the conceit of this was that she'd written these poems when she was in 6 months solitary confinement for treason, for sedition. And she was given a slate and a piece of chalk. She wasn't allowed to have, she didn't have the rights to have paper. And what I discovered was that, in fact, this idea that the poems were written on slate, because I always kind of thought, now hang on a minute, like, I know she had a great and phenomenal memory, but it just sort of somehow, and there were all sorts of other stuff that just didn't quite add up in terms of how she'd done it. And what I discovered is that she initially drafted some of the poems, because she was a successive redrafter, on her slate, but then she transcribed them in pencil onto Holloway toilet paper, and standard issue prison toilet paper of His Majesty's government at the time was a nice kind of grainy, tough kind of brown. And she wrote in pencil, and she secreted these bundles around herself, and she would give them to people who came to visit her, or she would give them to other people who were leaving the prison. She would get them to other people who would take them out. And I call these the toilet papers. And what had happened was that these had been bundled together, and it's a longer story we don't have time for, but they were a later edition, much later in life, long after she was dead. Richard Pankhurst, her son, when there was some trouble in Ethiopia, and he was worried about the papers, and he gave a bundle of stuff quite a lot later to the British Library. And there was this envelope, and I was going through looking at some other things which were her books, and there was this envelope, and I opened it, and it was full of thousands of sheets of this unsorted bog roll, as we call it in England. I don't know, would you call it that in America? What do you call it? Anyway, loo roll, toilet paper. And not only had she written these poems, but she'd written a 5-act play about the history of the Labour Party and the suffragette movement. And she'd also written all sorts of letters to Lenin and other kind of covert letters that needed to go to Russia. And I spent 6 months this was before the COVID pandemic. I spent 6 months in the British Library transcribing from toilet paper. It preserved very well.
Okay, so now you have the story behind the toilet paper. There is so much to talk about. I mean, we didn't even get to touch on her time in Ethiopia. Her, we kind of, mentioned her hiking through the Alps and taking this journey, evading the Secret Service of 3 nations, which she managed to do, to go and debate Lenin because they disagreed on the issue of
parliamentarianism.
Yes. Yeah. So we're kind of almost out of time. We are out of time, but I'm taking a little liberty as co-chair of the festival to extend because I mean I can't emphasize enough how important this book became to me this whole fall. I mean, I lived with Sylvia this whole fall, and I'm still processing a lot of her work and how relevant it is to us today. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine everything you had to sift through. I mean, just you managed to distill it into 1,000 pages, and I know there's a
brief 1,000 pages.
It is a brief 1,000 pages, and because I know how much you had to cut out, or I have a sense of how much, or at least some of the stories you had to cut out, which I really kind of want to know. I want to just really fast forward to the end of her life. She was buried in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia at the time, stood at attention for 2 hours during the service. Then he led the procession to her grave, and she was buried. She was the only non-Ethiopian to ever be buried in the Patriot Cemetery in Ethiopia until 2017, when her son Richard Pankhurst died, and he was buried there. So we didn't have time to kind of go through how she got there, but I hope everybody will buy this book. It's not an easy book to read. This isn't beach reading, but it's so important for anybody who's an activist, anybody who is a student of history, anybody who's interested in revolutionaries and in feminism and in labor movements. And socialism should really know about Sylvia Pankhurst. I was telling my friend Mark Lamont Hill about your book, and his first reaction was the first reaction that I had. I can't believe I've spent my whole life not really knowing about Sylvia Pankhurst. So I want to just give you sort of the last word to tell us whatever you want about Sylvia, whatever just leave us with something about Sylvia. And if you want to talk about that extraordinary funeral in Ethiopia, that's wonderful too.
Well, you've evoked it, and it was extraordinary, and it's a mark of the respect, and she still is. And I end the book, in fact, in Sylvia Pankhurst Street. There isn't one in Britain, but in central Addis, there's Sylvia Pankhurst Street, and I was outside the Sylvia Pankhurst Cafe talking to people, and there was this guy who, you know, people were interested, and he wanted to share with me what he thought about her, and I asked him, and I said, what does she mean to you? And he said, he was quiet for a minute, and then he said, after God, Sylvia Pankhurst. But I think what she did, she was once, I can't find it right now, but she was asked to contribute to something which would be an obit. It was a collection, and she was asked about how she would like to be remembered, and she said, you know, what would be said of her after she died. And she said a couple of things, but the most important was that she never abandoned any cause or any people in its darkest hour of need, particularly when it was unpopular or unsupported. And that, I think, is why we celebrate Sylvia Pankhurst now, and why I think it's a bit naughty to say what the dead would be doing, but I have absolutely no doubt she'd be reporting on Palestine rights in one of her newspapers, if not participating.
I love that. I love that you ended with that, particularly because it is so relevant to where we find ourselves in as Palestinians now. It is still it's still okay to say the worst things about us that in public discourse that you know that wouldn't be dared uttered about other people. It is still taboo and dangerous to one's livelihood and one's professional aspirations to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. And I think Sylvia Pankhurst, I know she would there's no doubt in my mind she would be right there with us, supporting BDS, and she is an example to me of the kind of activist and warrior that I want to be. Thank you,
You
Rachel. Thank you for bringing. This is a gift. It's really a gift, and I hope everyone will buy this book. It's available in our bookstore, so please buy it. And it's actually, I couldn't believe that it was modestly priced. I thought it was going to be, you know, a couple $100 for such a big, but it's not. It's amazing. So I'm really.
Have you got finished copies?
No, I don't. I mean, it's
right.
but I saw that, but it's
right.
priced online. Yeah.
Wow, brilliant.
Oh, okay. Is it? Oh, sorry. Jacqueline just said it's pre-order. That's who you saw. That's who you can hear. I don't know if you heard laughing. She's in the other room. She's listening to you. She has her earphones in. She can hear herself laughing. But anyway, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Rachel. It is a joy to have you. It's always wonderful to see you and to talk to you. And
thank you for having me. And also, can I just say hi? I've seen some friends out there, Natalie, Muse. You know, it's really and everybody, and the new friends I haven't met yet. But it's just really great. So just wanted to say hi, and it's been wonderful to spend this Sunday evening as it is here with you. And no pasaran.
And to our audience members, don't forget the next session is Palestinian cinema with May Masri and Victoria Britton. And this evening we are going to have our keynote, and it's going to be live streamed. So if anybody is not registered, if you know people who aren't registered who want to watch it on Facebook, it's going to be live on Facebook. And thank you.
Thank you.